Excellent, thank you. So we're in the sugya at the top of Ein Hey Omud Aleph, and we spent quite a lot of time looking at how Rashi learns Motea'ch chut shel tefira b'Shabbos chayev. That one who stretches a thread on Shabbos is chayev for so doing. And very briefly, Rashi learns that this is a tightening of a thread which brings two cloths together, and it's a form or a tolda of Tofer, even though you're not doing the stitching in and out of the thread, which is what normally defines the melachot of stitching. Nonetheless, it's a melacha because I'm tightening threads, and the core of the melacha of Tofer is to tighten threads. Edward, I'm getting a little bit of feedback from you. If you don't mind just muting yourself unless you want to speak, sorry. Or maybe it's Paul, I don't know. It's from someone I'm getting a little, just the two of you unmuted. So this is the view, obviously unmute yourself if you want to ask something, but just, so this is the view of Rashi. The Rambam, which I printed in the source sheets, says something else, and it's not entirely clear what the Rambam means. This is the Rambam Perek Yud Halacha Tes, and the Rambam says HaTofer shtei tefiras chayev. Fine, that's the din of Tofer. V'yishakoshu rosh chotin, you have to tie a knot. And then right at the end of the Halacha, the Rambam says the Motea'ch chut shel tefira b'Shabbos chayev. If one Motea'ch stretches or tightens a sewing thread on Shabbos chayev, mipnei shehu mitzarchei hatefira, because this is from the needs of tefira. This is from it's unclear even actually how to translate the phrase. It's from the tzorach hatefira. It's from the needs of tefira. So what exactly does this terminology mean? So the Magen Mishnah, I'm not going to read it inside, the Magen Mishnah simply brings Rashi, and then he says, Rabbeinu pirish tam ache. Rambam explains a different explanation, Shamaticho Motea'ch hatefira. So all the Magen Mishnah basically tells us is that the Rambam gives a different explanation. Don't think that Rambam's learning the Gemara like Rashi. He has his own shot in the Gemara. Now, the Chai Adam, Rabbi Avram Danziger, who was a Chutan with the Vilna Gaon and a semi-Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, and wrote an enormously important halachic work, in Sif Gimel says, Osram Toyach Chut Shel Tefira, Kedei Shelo Yeh Kavot. You're not allowed to stretch a thread in order that it shouldn't be crinkly. Kavot is like a zigzag crinkle, where it's sort of crinkly. You're allowed to stretch it to spread it out. By the way, I printed the Chai Adam in Sif Base also, which is the longer paragraph that I printed, simply because there the Chai Adam talks about the other halacha, which is using a thread or a cord to tighten, when you tighten a cloth, to bring cloths together. And the Chai Adam says what we discussed, that if this is done as a sort of one-off permanent thing, then it would be asa. But if it's done as a replacement to buttons or Velcro, like the sort of picture that is Elizabethan end of sleeves, where you sort of have a cord that you tighten to make it tight around the arm, the wrist, or you hoodie nowadays, where you sort of pull a cord to tighten it around the head. In these cases, this would be mutter, because you sort of open and close it the whole time. That's like a button or a zip or a Velcro. That's not a melacha. That's not a melacha at all. So that's why I printed the earlier source, in which the Chai Adam brings the tightening a thread in order to join cloths together, and also what we discussed, that if it's done as a way of opening and closing, that's not a problem. But in Sif Gimel, he brings the halacha of pulling a thread just to straighten it, so it shouldn't be zigzags, so it shouldn't be crinkled up. And it's a fascinating example of how a later posek deals with the words of an earlier posek with whom he doesn't agree. Because in his footnote, the Nishmas Adam, on this Pesach of the Chai Adam, he brings the Rambam. The Rambam says this is Mitzarche HaTefira. He then brings the Beis Yosef, and the Beis Yosef understands the Rambam to mean that you are stretching the thread so that it shouldn't be crinkly, so that it shouldn't be kavots, as Mitzarche HaTefira, as apparently a preparatory step for sewing. So as you sew, if the thread gets crinkly, you straighten the thread out in order to do the continuation stitches. And then the Chai Adam disagrees at length with the Beis Yosef. He doesn't agree with this at all. He says this is not a good reading in the Rambam. In a minute, we'll see why. So he doesn't think the Beis Yosef read the Rambam right. And he thinks the Rambam means really like Rashi. And then that's even what the Magen Mishnah meant. Even the Magen Mishnah never meant to say that the Rambam means a different setup or scenario to Rashi. He just meant that the Rambam explains it in a slightly different way, the concept behind it. And that the core Rambam doesn't mean to say like the Beis Yosef, that this is referring to straightening a thread. So let's just summarize what we've said so far. The Rambam says that brings out Gemara and says you can't stretch a thread because it's sarchei tefira, it's the needs of tefira. The Beis Yosef, which I could have printed, but I just didn't because it was longer. The Beis Yosef translates the Rambam to mean that stretching a thread to remove the crinkles, the wrinkles, is a preparatory step, is an enabler of tefira, and that's the melacha that we are talking about over here.
Why?
Chai Adam disagrees and says, no, the Rambam means like Rashi, that's how he's explaining the Gemara. He doesn't mean something else. And yet, Gary, I'll come to you in a second, and yet the Chai Adam still brings this halacha that you're not allowed to straighten the thread. But he tweaks the halacha, because the Rambam says chayav. And if you understand the Rambam to mean straightening threads, as per the Beis Yosef means pulling out a thread to stop it being crinkly, then the Chai Adam should have said chayav. And he doesn't say it, he says osa. So he respects the psak of the Beis Yosef by saying don't do this on Shabbos, but he's not willing to write chayav because he doesn't believe this is the correct reading in the Rambam, because it doesn't make sense to him that this should be the melacha. And in a minute, we'll see why he doesn't think this should be the melacha. Sorry, Gary.
I'm sorry, I was trying to interrupt it. How does uncrinkling a thread help you do tefira?
So it would appear, I'm not an expert in sewing, but it would appear that threads sometimes get crinkly. The reason this happens, by the way, is because to make a good thread, you take the wool, you spin the wool to make a thread, and then you take another piece of wool which is spun the opposite way around, and you put the two together, and the tension works against each other to get twisted. And it appears sometimes you have this, you can see this with your tiktors, for example, which are made like this. And you see sometimes they get crinkly when the threads get misaligned or something of the sort. And it appears you can't sew well with such a thread. And that's the melacha that's being done over here. So it appears to be the case. Okay. So just to summarize, the Rambam says you're chayav because of sarchei tefira. The Chai Adam says that means the same as Rashi, with just a different explanation. But the Beis Yosef learns this is a new malacha, a new form of tofer, straightening threads as sarchei tefira is what the Rambam means to say you're chayav. The Chai Adam isn't willing to paskin that he's chayav. He doesn't think this is correct shat in the Rambam, but nonetheless he says it's osa to do so. Now, why does the Chai Adam disagree with Beis Yosef? He says this is tumua. And only started the second line in the Nishmas Adam in the footnote. He says this is tumua. Even where you do two stitches and in and out. Shatofa mamish, where you literally sewed your potter in no shakash unless you tied the knot. How can it be that you're chayiv for preparing for tefira and you're not chayiv when you do an actual stitch, which is more than preparing for tefira, but it's actual stitching itself because it's not knotted. You should even chayiv for one stitch. Because that's surely preparation for tefira. If straightening the thread is chayiv as preparation for tefira, then one stitch is preparation for a second stitch. And Avadai, he says the Rambam doesn't mean this. So the Beis Yosef learns that the Rambam learns that there is a melacha of straightening a thread, and this is what the Gemara is teaching us, a remarkable Gemara, because it is sarchei hatefira, it is from the needs of sewing, from the needs of stitching. Now, before we even think about answering the Chai Adam's question, what on earth does all this mean? How can sarchei hatefira become a malacha? How can it become tofer? In the Mishkan, they did tofer, they did sewing. Where do we find that sarchei hatefira is also a malacha? And the answer is this would appear to be a pattern in the Rambam. And this is presumably where the Beis Yosef is coming from. The Beis Yosef knew a thing or two about reading Rambam, obviously, and he seems to have understood that this is a general pattern of the learning of the Rambam. And I only thought to add this to the sources really in the last minutes. I sent it on the WhatsApp group for those of you that didn't manage to have a a look at this, a series of examples in the Rambam where the Rambam uses such terminology, and other cases where the Rambam doesn't use the terminology, but the Mefarshim think this might be what the Rambam means. So I'm not going to go through these inside because I didn't send the sources in time, but just, excuse me, but just have a look at a couple of examples in the Rambam. The Rambam says in fact, I'll just read the whole Rambam inside because it's a remarkable Rambam. The Rambam, if I can find where I printed it for myself. The Rambam says in Perik Ches Halacha, well, we'll go out of order. Look at Perik Tes Halacha Yud Aleph. The Rambam says, Hamachabis begodim, washing clothes, is a tolda of melabain, it's a tolda of whitening wool. When you get wool, you need to bleach it as part of the cleaning process, and laundering clothes is a tolda of that. Then he carries on and he says that when you squeeze the garment to get water out of it, this is also machabis and yochayev. Why is it also machabis and yochayev? Because sechita is mitzorchei kibbus. It's from the needs of kibbus. In other words, the only way you can wash clothes, launder clothes, is by squeezing the water out of the clothes. And therefore, this is sorchei kibbus. This is from the needs of kibbus, and therefore would appear to be would also be included in the melacha. Note, by the way, that the Rambam doesn't say that it's a tolda. He seems to say this is literally machabit because this is part of the process and needs of laundry. And then he gives a comparison. He says, where do I see from that more minor acts that you do, that's a tzorchei, part of the needs of the melachot chayiv? He says, kamoi shahagosa mitzarchei habishul, in the same way as stirring is from the needs of cooking. If you cook in a pot and you don't stir, then the bottom will get very hot, or eventually maybe heat rises, the top will get hot, the bottom won't get hot, part of the dish will heat, part of it won't, part will cook, part won't, because some's under the flame, some's on the side of the flame. If you stir, you ensure even distribution of the heat, and it will cook well. So stirring is mitzorchei bishul, is from the necessary steps of bishul, and therefore you are chayav for hagasa as part of bishul. So this seems to be a pattern in the Rambam, in which the Rambam says that something which is the tzorech, a need for the melacha, is also included in the melacha. Now, the Rambam also has other examples where the Mefarshim explain that this might be what the Rambam means, and I'll just very briefly run through a couple of the other examples. Another example is in Perik Ches Halacha Beis, and I printed this again. The Rambam there is talking about zoreah, and the Rambam says if you soak seeds, chitin or so'orin, barley or wheat seeds in water, this is a tolda of zoreah, and you're chayiv. It's tolda of zoreah, and you are chayiv for it. And again, some of the Mefarshim explain why would you soak these seeds and why they are tolda of zoreah. Because in preparation for planting the seeds in the ground, it helps if you soak them. This is well known, children soak seeds and they begin germinating. Basically, it cracks, every seed has a shell around it. And when the shell cracks open, the DNA within the seed comes out, begins germinating, and it produces a plant or whatever it is. Soaking the seeds makes it better able to be planted in the ground. And the Rambam therefore says this is a tolda of Zuriah. Why? Perhaps because it's sorchei Zuriah, it's from the needs of Zuriah, of sowing. Finally, in Perik Tes Halacha Yud Daled, the Rambam says that if you add a dye to water, you are chayiv. And here's a very interesting one, because he says, how much are you chayiv for? What quantity? He's discussing shiurim, measures. What quantity are you chayiv for? Now, the Gemara says that for tzuveya, you're only chayiv if you dye a certain length of thread or a certain quantity of fabric. And the Rambam says when you dye water, you need to have dyed enough water to make dye in order to dye this quantity of thread or cloth. In other words, the Rambam isn't saying that the melachot of tzuveya is because you're coloring the water. Coloring water in and of in itself is not the melachot of dyeing, of coloring, because colored water isn't something that needs dyeing in this way. You're preparing dye. To prepare dye, you take a chemical, you put it into water, you mix it with the water, you now have this very strongly colored water, you then soak a cloth in that mixture, and you will dye the cloth. But the Rambam says that you're already chayav for the melachot of tzuveya when you add the chemical to the water. Not because you're coloring the water, but because you're producing enough dye to color the requisite quantity of cloth. So the Ravid already picks up on that, and I printed this, and he says, where do we find that this is severe? Dyeing water isn't severe, it doesn't make sense, there's lots of proofs against this, but this is the view of the Rambam. And again, a possible explanation is because this is from the tzorech of severe. This is a necessary preparation for severe itself. Now, if this is the correct reading in the Rambam, then a pattern emerges in which the Rambam considers tzorech, certain necessary steps, to also be the melacha. So this is a possible explanation of what the Rambam means in our context, that straightening the thread is, or uncrinkling the thread, is from the tzorech of tefillah, and therefore you are chayav on it. However, a word of caution is needed over here. And this, by the way, is how the Beis Yosef understood the Rambam. However, a word of caution is needed over here, because even though I whizzed through these examples, they're not all identical. First of all, in the example of bishul, and an example of stirring, in other words, and the example of squeezing where you wash, the Rambam doesn't say it's a tolda, he seems to just say this is machabis, he seems to imply it's the av. Whereas in the case of soaking seeds, and in the case of soaking seeds, the Rambam seems to say that this is, and in the case of putting the dye in, the Rambam says this is a tolda of zereya and a tolda of tzereya. So first of all, is this principle of the needs, does this make this an av or a tolda? Also, even though we speak about them all being the needs, they're not identical. When you're stirring, it's just from the needs of bishul, but it's facilitating directly the bishul itself. The pot is sitting on the flame, and I'm ensuring an equal spread of the heat by stirring the contents. So this directly causes the better bishul of the pot. Similarly, in the case of squeezing out the liquid from the garment, that is part of the kibbutz process. It's in a sense, it's not the washing itself, but it's part of the washing process. And therefore, when the Rambam says this is sorchi bishul or sorchi kibbutz, presumably what he means is this is doing the kibbutz itself or doing the bishul itself. Whereas straightening the thread isn't quite doing the sewing itself. It's a preparation for the sewing. It's a necessary condition for the sewing, but it isn't the actual act of sewing itself. So we have to be a little bit cautious in these comparisons. But the Beis Yosef seems to have understood that this is what the Rambam means, and that the Rambam considers a more general preparation or tzorech of kibbutz to be enough to make you chayav from melacha, even though these aren't each one's relationship to the its av, to the senior melacha, isn't identical. By the way, in the case of the Rambam, in our case of the Rambam, where the Rambam says you are Motea'ch chut, he doesn't actually say that this is a tolda. He just says you're chayav because it's sorchi tefillah. So it sounds like the Rambam is including this in the more direct category of things which are literally part of the melacha. So just to summarize what we've said so far, the Beis Yosef learns, which is the simplest reading of the Rambam, despite the criticism of the Chai Adam, the much later Chai Adam, the Beis Yosef learns that the Rambam means that this is the melacha of Tofer, just for uncrinkling the thread, because this is mitzorchi hatefillah. And if we take the Beis Yosef at face value, he is taking the Rambam at face value, and it's part of a pattern of halachas in the Rambam, in which the Rambam seems to learn that something which is a direct tzorech of the melacha, directly enough part of the process, even though it's not the melacha itself, is part of the av, or on some occasions maybe a tolda, but seems to be linked to the melacha. This is a remarkable chiddush. It's one that I was completely oblivious to till I learned this sugya and other kindred Rambams. But this seems to be how the Beis Yosef is meant to be understand the Rambam. That it is sorche hatzvira.
Can I just quickly ask? Sorry, one second. I'm not sure about the mitzvahs, because with our case, is it a case that the sewing, the original sewing, has come apart, or is Rambam talking about any type of straightening? Because if it's more to do with the melacha, if it's come apart and then you're redoing it, isn't it? Or...
No, what you're saying is correct, but that's exactly why I'm getting excited in the Rambam. Excuse me. And that's exactly why I'm finding this Rambam fascinating. Rashi says you're tightening the threads and you're bringing the cloth together. So I can live with Rashi. It's a beautiful sugya. There's enough of a chiddush that I see why you need the sugya to tell me this, because it's not obvious that this is identical to sewing. I'm not doing an act of sewing, but I can hear what the chiddush is. I can understand it. I'm bringing the cloth together by tightening the threads. So in Rashi, it's a beautiful sugya. It's adding a dimension and a layer to tefillah, which is understandable. It's not identical to tefillah, but it's telling me another dimension of tefillah. But the Rambam, according to the Beis Yosef, is telling me something radically different. This isn't about pulling the cloths together. It's about, in the sewing process, I sometimes need to straighten the thread, which has become crinkled, and this act of straightening, because it's a tzorech, it's a necessary part of the sewing, is also a melacha. And that's a massive chiddush. But I'm struggling with it because it's a bit too much of a big chiddush for me to digest. I don't really know what this means. It's not the melacha, I'm not sewing, it's simply a preparation for sewing or a need of sewing. And yet the Rambam says this is enough to make it the melacha. So I don't really understand this, other than there seems to be a pattern in the Rambam in which the Rambam says many things which are parts of the needs of the process of the melacha. And I'm simply pointing out that even though sorchei melacha is used across the Rambam in many contexts, they're not all identical, and we shouldn't confuse them. Some of them are easier. Meikis I get, there's an intuition. You're stirring, which is directly facilitating the cooking. I hear why that's a melacha. But straightening the threads, I struggle a little bit more with. It seems to be a preparation, but doesn't directly bring the cloth together. So I share that for you for what it's worth. We're in good company in struggling with it, because the Nishmas Adam also struggles with it. But this would appear to be how the Beis Yosef learns it. Yes, Edward, sorry.
It seems to me that Tochei Malacha means an integral part of the Malacha, not a preparatory step, because the stirring, I mean, if you've got a pot on the stove and you don't touch it, there's no bishul. But if you stir it, then you've enhanced the cooking process and it's bishul. And the wringing out of is also that. I think it seems to me that because you've also got an issue of shiur. The shiur for tofer is shtei tefiros, and if you simply uncrinkled it without there being shtei tefirot, then I think it has to be you're uncrinkling it, and that's the same as pulling it through. I think we have to be careful to learn each malacha independently. Yes, there is this idea of tzarchei tefirah, which means you don't have to do the whole malacha from scratch. So stirring is not the entirety of bishul, but it's an integral part of bishul. And it could be that uncrinkling is just the same as stretching if you uncrinkle in a way that's sufficiently significant.
So your words are well taken, and I would endorse your words. And in some respects, you're making the point I was making in a clearer form than the way I said it. So I'm going to adopt your terminology. You are correct in what you're saying, and this is in essence what I'm struggling with in understanding the Rambam, because tzorchei melacha is a chiddush of the Rambam. I hear that. It's a beautiful chiddush of the Rambam. The needs of the melacha. Now, in the case of meigis and kibbutz, you are correct. It's the needs of the melacha, not in the preparatory sense, but in the sense that it actually does the melacha. And you hear the chiddush of that. Not only is putting a pot on the flame the melacha bishul, but stirring it, which redistributes the heat, is also the melacha bishul. And similarly with kibbutz, very, very nice. With uncrinkling the thread, though, I hear that this is a tzorech of the melacha, a needs of the melacha, but it doesn't appear to be doing the melacha itself. It's there, I'm using the word preparatory. It seems to be a preparatory need as opposed to a need in process. And that's what I'm struggling with. What makes that a melacha if it's indeed preparatory? The best example I have of a similar thing is the soaking of the seeds or the putting of the chemicals into the water to make the dye, which are also preparatory. However, there the Rambam doesn't use the language of tzarchi. He just says it's a tolda without using the language of tzarchi. So we have a spectrum of concepts which are not identical, either in language nor in content, but seem to be somewhat analogous. And all I'm doing here is making a stew of similar ideas, and I'm not claiming it's particularly.
The Rambam's clearly aware of the need for tofer shtei tefirot when he writes mitzarchei tefirah, because he's only he's only said Tofer II 2 lines earlier.
So we could, by analogy to dying, suggest a similar model. And this would answer the Nishmas Adam's question. The Nishmas Adam said, 1 minute, if preparatory steps are enough, what happened? Why shouldn't 1 stitch be enough? And the answer maybe would be preparatory steps of the quantity of 2 stitches. So just like the Rambam says that adding chemical to water is the toldar because it's preparatory, how much do you need to add? Enough to be able to dye this quantity of fabric. So similarly, maybe straightening threads would be enough to be the melachot of Tofer because it's preparatory Tofer, as long as you straighten enough thread to do 2 stitches. So we could resolve this issue in the Rambam, but I don't have great answers for this.
You keep using the word preparatory, and I think it's not. I think it's an integral part. So I think he's talked about uncrinkling the thread in the same context as the pulling the thread through. She's kind of remaking a thread. So
where did he say it in the context of putting it through?
Well, because this whole where we're learning here is in the context of our sugi, which is pulling the thread through.
No, you're being persuaded by Rashi's reading the Gemara, Edward. I don't know if the Rambam did learn it's pulling it through. Rashi translates the literal words of the Gemara, Motea'ch shel tefira, you stretch a thread. So Rashi tense the thread. So Rashi says you tense it to tighten the slack and pull it through. But the Rambam doesn't say it. The Rambam just says if you straighten a thread, you're chayiv because it's sorchi tefira, which the Beis Yosef understands to mean you're straightening the thread from its crinkle. Now, whether that's a thread that's already inside the stitching and you're straightening it, and somehow it's analogous to stirring, it's literally bringing the cloth together through so doing or not, I'm not entirely sure. But the Rambam doesn't, in and of in itself, you don't see that the Rambam learns that this is about bringing fabric cloths together. That's how the Nishmas of Adam disagrees with the Beis Yosef and learns that. It's not self-evident in the Rambam that that's the case at all. We can't be seduced by Rashi's reading the Gemara to think that's what the Gemara says, but the Rambam appears to have had a different translation of the Gemara.
But it's not, we don't see that the Rambam had a different translation of the Gemara. And if you look in the Maggid Mishnah, the Maggid Mishnah at the end says, Rabbeinu Pirish Ta'am Acher, a different reason. He so the Maggid Mishnah has quoted Rashi, and at the very end of Rashi says, Zuhi tefirosai v'chayav, and the Rambam says, the Maggid Mishnah is seeming to say it's actually the same heichatem, so it's the same thing that's happening, it's just a different reason for the chiyuv. So
this is how you are correct, and this is the Nishmas Adam's point against the Beis Yosef. In other words, we have a Rambam that says if you make taut a thread, you are chayiv because it's sorchei tefira. So the Maggid Mishnah understands that to mean, like Rashi, or perhaps understands it to mean, that's how the Nishmas Adam understands the Maggid Mishnah, like Rashi, you're bringing the cloth together, and through so doing, you're doing tefira, and the Rambam just gives a slightly different explanation for the time. The Beis Yosef doesn't learn like that. The Beis Yosef says that you're straightening the thread which has become crinkled, and that's chayiv because it's sorchei tefira, it's the needs of tefira. And we find the word needs of tefira used in the Rambam elsewhere to mean something that's very different to the melachot itself. To mean stirring as opposed to cooking and so on and so forth.
We don't. I mean, I can't agree with that. I agree with what Edward said, is that the 2 proofs that you brought from sorchei tefira are fundamentally different. And I think we just end up with the Beis Yosef. And the other 2 proofs you brought, they talked about toldos. So where I find myself now is that the Beis Yosef is difficult and we have no understanding of it.
I'm okay with you finding yourself there. All I'm trying to do is the Nishmas, and you're in good company, Nishmas Adam also found the Beis Yosef difficult. All I'm trying to do is label which range of the territory the Beis Yosef would find himself in, and I'm convinced the Beis Yosef says something that we all find difficult to swallow, which is that somehow or other straightening the thread. Let's avoid English. Let's avoid me adding in anything of my own. All the Beis Yosef says is straightening the thread, which is sorchei tefira. The Rambam says is chayiv. Right? And we're all struggling to make that palatable. The Nishmas Adam, perhaps the Maggid Mishnah, move the Rambam closer to Rashi, but that's not apparently how the Beis Yosef learns it. So all I'm doing here is trying to say what I don't know the answers to the Beis Yosef, because you're absolutely right. Edward is right. You are right. This is distinct from other examples. But what's the lay of the land? Where did the Beis Yosef think he was going with this? I think the answer is by comparing it to the other uses of the word sorchei tefira, albeit they're not identical to this, and that somehow or other the Rambam understands something which is a an integral step, a very linked step, a need, a tzorach. I'll even miss out the word preparatory, because you're right, it's not identical. But it's something which is a step or a need of tefillah or other melachas, similarly, is also called a melacha. And at this point, I surrender. I don't know more to say than that, other than linking it as part of a pattern in the thinking of the Rambam, in which the Rambam seems to say something which is a tzorach and a need is connected. I just want to finish off because we've gone over our time and I really want to move on to the next sugya here. I haven't had time to explore this in detail, but the Rabbeinu Chananel on the last sugya, on several sugyas back, in fact on the sugya of Chalsa, if you remember, on Ayin Daled on the base, the Chayv to the Puma, Chayv Shorosh Esrei, the Chayv 13, he, in listing the 13, he talks about Motea'ch chut as one of the 13 steps, and he references this Motea'ch chut. Did I not give you the? Oh, did I not print the Rabbeinu Chananel? Okay, this is terrible. I evidently didn't print Rabbeinu Chananel. I apologize. You know what? So I'm going to actually put the Rabbeinu Chananel on the source sheet, and we'll just look at it very, very briefly for 3 minutes at the beginning of the next year, because I want you to see the Rabbeinu Chananel before I say anything. So we'll stop there, and I wish you all a good day. And next year we will mainly look at Halomi Dov Amin Amagus, but I'll just reference Rabbeinu Chananel on the sukkah for 1 minute.
So you share on Tuesday?
I'll go share on Tuesday. Yeah, definitely. We need to move on. I'm going to move quite fast through the Gods of Gemaras, not because they don't deserve attention, but just because our main focus is Halacha. But I'll give a few shiurim on very fascinating Gods of Gemaras also.
Cool.
Have a good day.
I'm happy to send an updated source sheet, which has all the sources combined, given that I messed up a bit and didn't put them all on. So I'll post that on the group also.